I think many people were here with us this morning for the first panel, but I know there are some folks who weren't. So if you'll bear with me, those who were, I'm just going to repeat a couple of things. I'm Rebecca Winthrop. I'm the director of the Center for Universal Education here at Brookings, and we're really pleased to have you. Our work here at the center is focused on education in the developing world quite broadly. We work on access to quality education for all. Oftentimes we talk about equitable learning, meaning equitable opportunities for young people to learn and develop their full capacities. We had a session earlier this morning about financing and the financing gap, and it brought up quite a number of issues, wide-ranging. And this session today is really talking about the quality gap. And, you know, we have 1,000 more days left to meet the Millennium Development Goals and the Education for All goals. And a really important dimension of solving the problem and a barrier to doing it is trying to make sure the connection between enrolling kids into school, mastering the range of things they need to learn while in school, completing school, and progressing on to higher levels of education is well linked up. And young people are able to move through a system and to learn what they're supposed to do, that both to set them up for further education and being able to complete their schooling and to set them up with the skills they need for life. We know that 250 million kids around the world are unable to read with any proficiency even after spending 4 years in school. We also know that there's around 200 million kids in school who do not have the adequate skills for their lives and their livelihoods, youth in particular we're talking about here. And the panel today is really going to be talking about, in particular, the gap between once young people are accessing education, the gap between the quality of the learning that they are accessing. And this is a problem that is a global problem. The quality of education and the ability to learn and master skills through the education provided is vastly different for the rich as it is for the poor. Right here in Washington, D.C., we have that problem. There's a 70% achievement gap between African American students and white students. This largely maps onto socioeconomic classes, and that gap holds true in a range of other countries. There's also a big gap between developing low-income countries and rich countries in terms of learning achievement. And it's definitely a social justice issue. It is not right. It's not fair to children. It doesn't fulfill their rights to education, that they can get to school and receive a very poor quality education. And it's also a development imperative. We need young people to master the skills they need for their lives and livelihoods for many reasons that I won't repeat from the first session because I'm sure you all know them. I wanted to also repeat again the regrets from the UN Special Envoy Gordon Brown, who was going to be here to chair this session and had to attend instead the funeral for Margaret Thatcher that was today in the UK. He says he wishes you all well and is very interested in hearing about the discussion and the outcomes, in particular the solutions to this problem. That we discussed today. What we're going to do before I introduce the panelists, just let me tell you the plan of action. My colleague Kevin Watkins will come up and sort of lay the land. We have a range of data that we've been working on here at the center in terms of scoping this injustice problem between the quality gap between, in particular, marginalized groups, the poor and the haves, and the higher socioeconomic groups, in particularly relation to this access, learning, completion, progression question. And then we will invite up our panelists, and we're going to ask them to talk about, and I'll moderate a discussion, ask them to talk about, what are different ways that they're tackling this issue from their various perspectives. And I'm very pleased to welcome our panel members. We have Bela Raza Jamil, who's the Director of Programs from the Center of Education and Consciousness based in Pakistan. We have Albert Motivans. Albert. I keep calling, I learned 2 days ago that for like 10 years I've been calling him Albert because he's based in Montreal and all his colleagues call him Albert with a French accent. And then I realized that's not what he calls himself, it's Albert. So I'm, you know, he's never corrected me. He's very kind. Albert Motivans, who's the head of education indicators and data analysis and the data analysis section based in Montreal at the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. And we have Sumaya Saluja, who's the program coordinator of the YP Foundation based in India. And I just wanted to take a little moment before I invite you up, Kevin, to also say it's not written next to her title, but Sumaya is a member of the youth advocacy group that is connected to the UN Secretary General's Global Education First initiative. They're here all week. This group is there's 15 young people who've been selected from 500 people that have been nominated globally. It was a very competitive process. We have been hosting them here, and it's been an incredible chance to get to know them. They're all phenomenal from all over the world, and I was hoping all of you guys could stand up and wave your hands high. So in the lunch right after this panel, where we hope you will all stay for. Okay, thanks, guys. You should all, well, talk to whoever you like. Free to talk. But I highly recommend you to search out these young people. In particular, if you want to pass a message on to the UN Secretary General, perhaps, or the head of UNICEF, or the head of UNESCO, or the head of the World Bank, their chair, Cherner Ba, will be meeting, as he is formally part of the steering committee for the Global Education First initiative, with all of them tomorrow. So it's also quite useful for you. With that, Kevin, can I ask you up to talk us through?
Thanks, Rebecca. I should probably apologize again for not being Gordon Brown. And I'm also not a youth leader, although I would love to be young. So what I want to talk about right now is, as Rebecca said, looking at some of these big issues of inequality in education with respect to access and learning. And I'm going to focus on sub-Saharan Africa. But I think the storyline for sub-Saharan Africa tells us something about the global picture as well, and the issues that I want to talk about are relevant globally. So let's just start with, this is to state the obvious, but I think to recognize what's at stake, when we talk about these issues of getting into school, progressing through school, and learning something in school, that we know that what happens in this process is absolutely transformative in terms of the lives of the kids involved. That if you're deprived of those opportunities, your health suffers consequences. You become more marginalized in society. Your prospects of securing a decent livelihood are diminished. And we know beyond the individual, there are nationwide consequences. We know from the work of Eric Hanushek and others that countries that succeed in raising access to school and the quality of learning that takes place in school stand to reap the benefit of a 2% per capita growth premium. Now, if you compound that over 25 to 30 years, it puts countries in a very different place than they would be if they don't secure those goals in education. So there's an awful lot at stake here. And when you think about Africa in particular, there's a lot at stake in terms of where the region is placed in what is an increasingly knowledge-based global economy. That if you look at, we often look at the wealth divide between rich and poor countries. But if you look at the education divide, that is actually, the wealth divide magnified many times over. You have countries like the United States or much of Europe where people entering the education system today can anticipate 15 or 16 years in full-time education. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the equivalent number is 2 to 3 years. Now, that's the source of inequality today. But if you think of what that means further down the road for Africa's place in the international trading system, the financial system, for the distribution of poverty around the world, this is something that has very big ramifications. And it's why I think, and this was a point that was made by all of the panelists this morning, that we need to make sure that education is right at the center of this broader development agenda, and we don't just compartmentalize it. Actually, these graphics are based on work that my colleague in CUE, Lauren Greubel, has been working on, which is trying to capture statistically that if you take the whole primary school age cohort and you ask the question, you look at the kids who are going into school and you say, what are their chances of getting through school and coming out the other end having learned something valuable that will expand their opportunities in life? If you take the full primary age cohort, primary school age cohort in sub-Saharan Africa today, it's around 127 million children. And if you ask yourself, what are the prospects for those children, based on the historic progression and learning rates in the region, this is what it starts to look like. 30 million of those children will never enroll in the education system of their country. Another 33 million will enroll but drop out before completing primary school. And many of this isn't a question of contrasting an access issue with a quality issue, because many of these kids are dropping out because of quality problems, because they're unable to meet basic learning competencies. Their parents can see that they're failing. They fail progression tests to move from one grade to the other. So this is the quality and the access issues coming together. Now, when we ask, I think it's important that we look behind the statistics on these issues. And when we ask the question, who are we talking about here? Because, let's face it, we're not talking about the sons and daughters of top civil servants in Lagos. We're not talking about the sons and daughters of, richer parts of the business community that live in gated suburbs of Nairobi. We're talking about people like this. If you look at the top left picture, this is a girl bride from northern Nigeria. Somebody who probably hasn't been to school for more than 2 years, has dropped out of school and has become and is married. This is a huge force, a suction force, pulling young girls out of the education system of their country. The picture below is a picture of artisanal gold miners in Mali. And there are something like 15 million children in the world who are out of school because they're working. Many of them in hazardous conditions like this, putting their lives, their limbs at risk every day. Of course, they're pushed into that position by the poverty that their households are in, by their need to generate income to meet nutritional needs. Again, this is part of a global problem. There are over 200 million children worldwide who should be in school, who are instead working in labor markets. This picture here is actually a little boy that I interviewed in the Democratic Republic of Congo in North Kivu. He'd been displaced. He was selling charcoal in order to pay for school fees, to go to a school that the community in his camp of displaced people had built themselves. There was no public support, but they had to pay for a teacher, and this was his way of trying to generate the money to do that. So kids who are in conflict-affected environments account for something like half of all out-of-school children now. This is a picture from northern Kenya. It's not that clear, but I think some of you, who maybe have worked on the region will understand the context. I've visited schools like this. This is an environment where kids have no pens, no pencils. They do sums in the sand on the ground with sticks, usually with an untrained teacher. These are not kids who are getting a fair chance at developing opportunities for education. But the reason I wanted to show these pictures was just to focus us on, who is it who is behind the numbers? Because in each of these cases, the idea that you can resolve or you can eradicate the disadvantages they face by just expanding the system, by doing what you're doing on average, is misplaced. These are kids who face special constraints, who need additional support in order to get over the barriers that they're facing. It raises issues about equitable financing in education, about changing attitudes with relation to early marriage, about tackling these issues of child labour, and so on. I wanted to just show you one graphic from, this was developed by my colleagues, former colleagues, in the Global Monitoring Report in UNESCO. And I apologize to those of you who have seen this before. But what it does, it takes one country, which is Nigeria, and looks at the multiplier effects of different types of disadvantage. Because, you know, sometimes when we think about inequality in education, we think in boxes. You know, there's a wealth disadvantage, a gender disadvantage, a rural disadvantage. But in the real lives of the kids involved, these disadvantages interact with each other, and they have magnifying effects and multiplier effects across the system. So if you take a country like this, is just ranking a group of countries on the average number of years in school achieved by people in the age group 17 to 22. And you can see where Nigeria fits on this spectrum. It's just under 7 years. But if you divide Nigeria into the rich and the poor, there's a 6-year gap in opportunity. In other words, being born into a wealthy household will gain you 6 years worth of education, and inversely for people born into poor households. You know, this is a very stark example of a circumstance over which kids have no control, determining their opportunities for education. And if education is a basic right, it's the type of disadvantage that we have to eradicate. And if you look behind the wealth gap, there's an interlocking urban-rural divide. So there's a small urban-rural gap, even if you're wealthy. But if you're poor, the gap between the urban poor and the rural poor is equivalent to 3 years. And if you go a stage further back and divide that into rural boys and rural girls, you can see the gap gets progressively wider. That if you're a poor rural girl in northern Nigeria, your education entitlement is around 2.5 years. And even at a level, if you take it a level below that, and you go to poor Hausa girls in northern Nigeria, on average, they're getting less than 1 year in school. And the picture that I showed you of the girl in the context of the early marriage was a poor Hausa girl from northern Nigeria. So you know, this is just an example of the types of inequalities that have to be broken down if we want to achieve the goals. Now, just to go back to the numbers I was giving you before, so we've got around half of the primary school age cohort in sub-Saharan Africa who are dropping out before, either not getting into school or dropping out before they've had a chance to develop their basic education competencies. But here's the really distressing part of the story, or an even more distressing part of the story, that if you take kids who actually get through the primary school years and you test them against the sort of the basic learning skills that they need to flourish, you know, in labor markets, in their own lives, to expand their own opportunities and to participate in society. You know, you measure performance against the most basic indicators for numeracy and literacy, you find that over half of those kids who get through to the last grade of primary school come out without basic numeracy and literacy skills. And this is data that's drawn from regional learning assessments for sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you know, you have to say this is a pretty distressing state of affairs. That, you know, the idea that some of the poorest households in Africa are making huge sacrifices to keep their kids in school and to get them through an education system which is not delivering. You know, I think it's, you know, has to be one of the great development challenges that we're facing globally. And in the same way that there are these big social divides with respect to access to school in years in education, you see exactly the same story with respect to learning. That if you take, this is data from Malawi, from the SACMEC from the SACMEC data on minimum learning standard competencies. And you can see that on average, around half of children in Malawi are coming out of school without basic learning competencies. But behind that national average, there's a gender divide in learning. Young girls are less likely to learn than young boys. There's a rural-urban divide. The rural populations are less likely to learn than urban populations. And there's a wealth divide. If you're poor, you're less likely to learn than if you're wealthy. Now, you know, every country has a different story to tell here. But what I think these basic, the challenge and the questions that these basic numbers pose to us is, what do we do to close these equity gaps? And it seems to me that one of the big failings of the international donor community in education, and frankly of many governments as well, is that there is not a provision that's made in the education planning framework and the national education strategy for reaching the most marginalized. You know, there's an assumption that if you keep on doing what you're doing on average, eventually the education system is going to roll out and it's going to reach these kids on the margins of society. And I think the clear evidence from the last 10 years, the reason that we've seen progress stall in education is because we're failing to address these problems. We have public financing systems that are treating the poorest kids as though they're somehow the same as the richest kids, that are treating disabled children as though they're somehow exactly the same in terms of their financing needs or their support needs as other children. You know, we're treating children from ethnic minorities or in the poorest rural areas as though they're the same and have the same need as everybody else. And we're pretending that if you put a school in a village and a teacher in a classroom and a few books in the school, that kids who are forced by poverty into labor markets, forced out of school and into labor markets, will somehow come into school. And I think the message of this is that if we're serious about the human right to education, if we're serious about the idea that there should be an equal opportunity to education, we need to move towards systems of more equitable financing and national strategies that support governments who are trying to go the last mile. And one of the things that I think is very positive about this week is that we have a series of proposals and plans that are going into the World Bank and UN meetings, which actually sets out in a very practical way how you can start breaking down some of these inequalities. You know, it's achievable, it's affordable, and it's practical. You know, there are things that we can do in all of these areas. The fact that we're not doing them is to do with political will and I think our failure to send the right signals and to build the impetus from below. So, Rebecca, I'll leave it there, and thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, Kevin. Can the panelists come join me up here? Thanks so much. We're just finishing putting the last mics on our panelists, but thank you very much, Kevin, for really painting that picture, which indeed is a bit depressing. But I think what we should focus on in our conversation, and what I'm going to ask all of you on the panel to respond to, is what are strategies? What are possible solutions? What are different ways that we can tackle this problem, both at a very community level, a national level, as a policy level, as well as a global level? And Sumaya, I wanted to start with you. You work with communities in India and you work with the YP Foundation, and you also work with youth and youth advocates, and you tackle this issue in those communities. Could you just tell us a little bit about how you go about it, what types of things you do, what strategies seem to work?
Sure. So, thank you. I would actually like to start a little earlier from where we actually began and not where we are right now, because I think there are a lot of learnings that we had on the way of reaching where we are. And I'm going to pick up from an example from one of the communities that I've been personally working with for the last 6 years. It's 105 families. It's an urban slum, which is in Delhi, right in the center, yet gets completely hidden, with 300 children. And we went there, and it's largely migrants who've been living there for about 10 to 20 years, who've come from eastern India, or largely Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state in India. And it has many communities, if you may so, even among the 150 families, based on occupation, income, religion, language, because that also creates its divide. And I think the idea started with young people and this glass window, which exists, still does, between different communities and socioeconomic groups of young people who there's no space where they can come in, learn, talk, and even play, for that matter, and just share something. And I think it started with just that idea. And we started with the most obvious. We thought, let's start with maths and English, because that seemed most obvious to us. And we did that for 8 months, and we reached the letter F and the number 10. And we really then began to think and rethink in terms of, are we really looking at the symptom, or we are looking at the cause, and what is it that really what we are doing wrong in this? And I think the idea was actually to then start looking at what were really the causes, basic things in terms of their self-esteem, their communication, their concentration, something as simple as information, which they didn't have, their parents didn't have, and a complete lack of agency that children had with respect to adults and what was happening around them. The second was, once we did start doing that, we actually managed to transition all but 25 children into school. But that's when the real challenge, I think, for us began, because that was just scratching the iceberg when we said we've got children into school. And the questions that we really had were, one, how do you reduce this immense gap that exists between private schools and government-run/funded schools? Secondly, how do you work and ensure that children, once they reach the age of 14, are not covered by the right to education, and especially girls, how do you get them to stay on in schooling, especially when there is a certain level of also community backlash. There's one which is happening in schools in terms of the quality gap, but there's community backlash that happens with girls who are an exclusion when they're looked as quote-unquote independent. Secondly, how do you look at other opportunities for children who do have to drop out due to other pressures, or who never manage to go to school because they never fit into the bracket that the right to education covers? And thirdly, what about the children who still, and that's our struggle right now, children living with disabilities, children and when we look at gender, I do want to urge to broaden gender also to include other multiple gender identities. And the transgender community, for example, in India is completely excluded, and we don't even see them and notice them, and they don't even get registered. Formal ID being a huge problem in terms of even children getting into school when there is infrastructure, there is the will, there is the want, both from the parents and the children's side. But and formal ID works like the chicken and the egg. To get one, you need another one, and when you don't have any, then you're just running around in circles, because and a lot of communities that are migrating and there are no institutional deliveries, there is just no birth certificate. Therefore, you can't avail of any health, education, any service that is actually provided and hopefully available to the communities. I think in terms of solutions and some of the things that we've done is, one, work directly with children, and we've been working with them to get them to start articulating what they want to do and start developing their own roadmaps, so that when you talk about self-directed and self-motivated learners, it's coming from them. and then also to build their skills to start negotiating with adults, with their community members, and do this collectively and collaboratively with them. It also isn't all children will react the same way. I think it's a very individualized approach, and which is where a peer education program like ours works, where you're getting young people to work with smaller groups over a long period of time, and you're just really reacting. We're always reacting. I think our strategies change every year based on every year we sit down and we say, this is the current state, and then how do we move forward? The second is, I think it's really important for children to start and young people to start having support groups of other young people, so start connecting them with other communities where there are similar programs running. A lot of community-based programs run in a lot of in an insular manner, where they run within themselves, and the peer educators, or a lot of people call them change agents, run within, and actually to bring them out and start meeting each other and start coming out with common solutions, or just learn and share and feel that there is some sort of support that they have. Thirdly, we conduct school audits, which is really important for young people to start monitoring what is actually secured or given by the government. However, there is a fallback in that because it's quantitative still, it's not qualitative, so you can only do checklists of infrastructure, teacher attendance, but there is no way to monitor quality. The third is actually, and this is very important for girls, is to actually look at, and this is what we started right now, is to start looking at trying to challenge those traditional mindsets and concepts that exist in the community. And we're doing this through comprehensive sexuality education that runs in a peer-to-peer model, and actually to get young people, especially young girls, engage the boys, very important, and get them to have some agency with respect to their body, to be able to have mobility, and to actually start seeking the opportunities that they want to access. Just to close, it's really simple. I think for us, what's been really important we've been connectors, we haven't been directors. So we've gone in and we've actually just tried to see what's coming out and then respond to that. And secondly, I feel if you start mobilizing young people and get them to interact with each other, even within even in one city, it doesn't have to be cross-regional, cross-cultural is amazing, but even in one city, there's a lot there is to learn, to share, and to just create a support group where you can start building something.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Samaya. That's really interesting. I have a ton of questions and I want to hear more, but I'm going to rein myself in the interest of the audience, because I know all of you will actually be quite interested to hear more about the range of solutions that you talked about using. And thank you for that. Bela, can we move to you next? I'd be interested to hear, Sumaya had a really interesting perspective about how multi-sectoral and how you have to look at a range of leverage points when you're focusing on a population in a very confined sort of space. You're talking about one city, albeit probably a huge problem in India. What about sort of the different types of leverage points that you would have if you need to work across a country? You, in your work on these issues, particularly around sort of that question of the learning gap across Pakistan. Can you tell us a little bit about the types of things you guys have been piloting? The annual education status report, is certainly one that I imagine people would want to hear about.
Yes. Following in on what Sumaya said, and also the earlier panel, the most exciting part of the work has been the South-South exchange, the South Asia exchange, and to look at what are seen as good practices which create impact. So learning from the annual Status of Education Report initiative by Pratham in India, way back in 2008 and 2009, we began to look at ways of mobilizing countrywide attention to the issue of learning. We knew in Pakistan the challenge of access is there, but much more critical to that was, even if children were getting to school, what it is they were learning. And in Pakistan, the effort, from 2009, this is going to be our 4th year of doing ASAR, has been able to scale up the effort such that 9,000 volunteers, young people, are mobilized to collect information on learning levels of children. And of course, with that also the access gaps. And much like what we saw in the presentation, because the tools are three, we are looking at household level tools, we are looking at testing children up to grade 2 level competencies in basic numeracy and maths, as well as a school audit tool in the neighborhood. So when we are going to over 6,000 schools, 250,000 plus children, about 80,000 households, this is large scale, and it is district by district. And what it does give us is exactly that kind of wealth index, which identifies children from the poorest to the richest households in that geography. And like this last year, we covered 136 rural districts out of 145 and 6 urban districts. And to be able to gather those variations, not across households, but also within districts and across districts and across provinces. The excitement of something like that has been that, one, as a civil society, rights-based movement, it has played wonders, much beyond our expectations. We thought when the first one came out that the government is going to hold us and challenge us and say this is all wrong. Luckily, the government was also, through some donor support, running a Nielsen survey. And when they did that, this was only 0.5% apart. And from that, of course, everything became history, because every year this is done with the Nielsen survey just on access issues. And this has become a very big buzzword. So what do we do with that data? So when you see that, sure enough, for your primary age group, you have still 20% children who are not getting their right to education and have access challenges, but over 50% children who are not at grade 5 who graduate will not possibly have grade 2 level competencies. This becomes a very big buzz issue. So in terms of actions, 3 things. One, luckily from 2010, after the 18th Amendment, with the Article 25A inserted for right to education for 5 to 16-year-olds, just the same age group that we were testing, it meant that we could immediately link to the right to education movement. And with already 9,000 volunteers, lots of partner organizations, it meant that we could do big things with it. So we've run the 2 million, the first 1 million signature campaign, then the second million, and we'll be presenting that on the 19th for out-of-school children to be able to pressurize parliamentarians earlier and now the political parties to not only reflect in their manifestos their commitment to education, but those 5 action steps that they will take. So there's that kind of momentum is on. Secondly, to be able to focus on the programming side, whether it is civil society organizations or government, to see what are seen as low-hanging fruits. Where will they take the action first? Where are those union councils, those critical group of people, just like Sumayya's, where is it that it's going to have the largest impact? Now, and that has been very exciting, and we have also now just testing as we are speaking a program which is called Learning for Access. So what it does is it tries to again further deepen our relationship with the work in South Asia, and what we're trying to do is to do a 2.5 month or 3-month intensive program on literacy and numeracy, but also combined with it a lot of youth mobilization in those localities where children through the same tools can be identified, those out of school and those at risk in school of dropping out because they are not learning well. And with it, we'll combine some elements of leadership, citizenship, as well as teacher support, so that schools can begin to revive themselves. And government allows and communities allow more than this. This is not an issue of the government only. It's also an issue of citizens. And we are trying to be able to mobilize citizens who will be willing to be a part of this and take action and create the same kind of energy that we've created through the learning level, the ASA survey, for which everyone waits. And also now the politicians with the elections coming up on the 11th of May, to see how we will be holding people to account. Now, luckily, a program like this has, and the South-South support is exciting because we have 7 countries from East and West Africa, India and Pakistan in this, covering about 1.6 billion population. We are trying to take this forward and try to see it as a movement by the citizens, for the citizens and the government to improve what is seen as clearly a quality and a governance challenge, but also try to see what more can we do with our youth to be able to come up with innovative solutions, not just in terms of mobilization and learning, but also exploring technologies, cheap technologies, anything which will create high impact with lower costs.
Thank you, Bela. It's very inspiring to hear actually how this issue is taking such a widespread interest across the country at multiple levels, government as well as you're really starting a movement, I guess, in the country, which is...
It's called the Citizens Movement for Quality Education.
There you go, which seems to be key from everything that we've talked about. Kevin, I want to turn to you next. I think it'd be interesting for folks to hear a little bit about your work here at the center on finance with finance ministers. Particularly, I'm thinking of your work on Kenya about, a nationwide sort of leverage point is, one thing is creating a sort of grassroots movement, but another leverage point might be getting sort of finance ministers to more equitably allocate their government budget. So you can include the folks that are left out and can look at the quality gap as well for the kids who are in school. Could you share a little bit about that as a possible solution?
Sure. Just very briefly, I mean, I'll mention the work on Kenya because it's, I think, relevant more widely. Is what we did in Kenya. I mean, Kenya has made quite a lot of progress in education going back over the last decade. But as it has in the rest of the world, that progress has really stalled over the last 2 to 3 years. And if you look at the distribution of education disadvantage in Kenya, I mean, very crudely, most of the out-of-school population is heavily concentrated in the northern and northeastern region, and to some degree in urban slum areas. Now, when you go to the Ministry of Education, they have all sorts of strategies for tackling those inequalities. But then when you look at how money gets allocated, there's no relationship between the strategy and the money. And so basically you get the same per capita allocation if you live in a middle-class district in Nairobi as you get if you live in a really poor area in the north. But actually the real financing picture is worse than that because the money follows the children. And if children drop out of school, the regions that those children live in lose the money. And so it becomes a sort of cumulative problem. In other words, precisely the parts of the country that need the most financing support are getting the least financing support. And I think if you broaden that out a little bit, if you take the sort of people that you're working with, living in urban slums, that many of these kids are being drawn into labour markets because the household poverty gives them no alternative. And the idea that you could lift them out of that situation by equal per capita transfers, I think is pretty far-fetched, actually. And unfortunately, I think that the education plans that we've looked at, that one after another, they all have the right ambition. Many of them have the right programs in many ways, but they don't have the right financing in place. Even if you look at a country like Bangladesh, which has done very well in terms of getting children into school, there are still really big problems in the Chittagong Hill areas with ethnic minorities or with child labourers in that country. And there are no specific financing provisions for tackling those disparities. And to my mind, the big issue that this raises, it's an old question that Amartya Sen has written a lot about. There are a lot of different ways that you can think about equity. The way it gets thought about in most education plans is that equity means that every kid in the country gets allocated the same per capita financing. To my mind, that is not equity. That is a prescription for inequality. And the point that Amartya Sen makes is that if you're a disabled kid, in order for you to secure the same opportunity as someone who's not disabled, you need countervailing support, financial support, other types of support. And I think we need to move. I mean, Gordon Brown calls it progressive universalism. That we need a universal goal, but we need to recognise that kids starting in different places, the kids at the bottom need a hand up, and they're not currently getting it.
Do you want to say just 2 words on, or 2 sentences on, actually the Kenyan government actually taking up some different financing formulas that have an impact on this?
Yeah, well, what
as,
we...
again, sorry, as a good example of things that, is a solution that we could try to, leverage more in other places.
Yeah, well, we were very lucky that we had an opportunity to work with the Ministry of Northern Kenya and the Finance Ministry at a time when they were redesigning the financing formula for how they allocate resources. And these are small changes, but I think changes that will make a difference. So previously there had been no weighting for poverty, for example. And so we ran some numbers that basically looked at what you could achieve by putting into the formula a weighting for the depth of poverty in every district in the country. And you can do that for other indicators like the number of out-of-school children or the number of registered disabled children. But I think this is the thing about these financing formulas. They tend to be terribly boring and technical, but they're enormously important because they ultimately decide what are the resources that track children through the education system, and they determine how effectively resources are aligned against real need. So I do think this is one of the areas that, as an education community, we need to get a handle on much better.
Thanks, Kevin. Albert, tell us from the global perspective. You sit at UIS, you're the lead for education data, particularly this Learning Metrics Task Force, which you're heavily involved in. What are some sort of leverage points from the global perspective? What are some ways to tackle this?
Okay. Well, it seems a little bit counterintuitive now to go to the global level, because what we hear is that these issues, to really gain traction on reaching these marginalized populations, it's really about contextualized, nuanced approaches that take place in very localized contexts or areas. So when we think about the global, we think, well, but that's not where the issue is. But I would say that I think Kevin did a nice job of showing how these 2 perspectives are really important to have, both the local and the system level, because I think we need those human faces. We need those stories behind the statistics. We can't be looking just at numbers. There's enormous human costs here, but at the same time, we need to be able to communicate what the scope, what the magnitude of this issue is, or some of these issues are. But it goes further than that as well, because as we heard from the panel this morning, some of these populations are invisible in societies. They're kept away. They're hidden away. They're not seen. They're not visible. And I think we find the same issue in the statistics, that we don't always see these groups reflected in the information. And I would say probably a lot of the information that's collected, even through household surveys, is systematically excluding some of these disadvantaged groups. So we don't get a good picture of where they are. But just to say that I think we need that global perspective, to really communicate the enormity of some of these issues and the level of exclusion from education. I wanted to say just a few things about some of the work that we're doing, including Learning Metrics, but also the Out of School Initiative, which we work together with UNICEF. And what we're doing there is taking some of the same data that in fact, I think maybe some of the data that Kevin has shown is coming from this work, to kind of try to profile the different types of out-of-school children, and also try to get a better understanding of not only patterns of school entry, progression, completion, but getting a better sense of who is entering on time, who is progressing well, who is not, who is completing, who is not, and trying to get a better sense of some of the profiles of these different children. And as we saw in the case of Malawi, which is drawing on the learning outcome data, there we can see very clear policy directions, combining actually this view on participation and progression with learning outcomes. We can actually see some very clear ways forward for Malawi, or not ways forward, but let's say policy options that they need to address at different parts of their system. So that's one thing we've done, and we've done this work now in 26 countries, including some of the highest out-of-school population countries. There's slowly coming out at a regional level. The Latin American and Caribbean report has come out already. Others are expected in the next few months for East and Southern Africa, for West and Central Africa, for South Asia. And some of this work now is actually going to a second level, where, for example, we're actually working in countries to better target. Now, in some of these countries, the out-of-school population is much smaller, and it's very clear it's more clear who they are, and it's largely children with disabilities. I mean, in this case, we're working in a few countries to better track these children. So we're going beyond just the profiling to then kind of implementing approaches to better track some of these specific populations. And then to say a few words about the Learning Metrics Task Force. I'm sure you've heard about it a lot, especially if you've come to this August institution. UIS and Brookings Institute are co-convening the Secretariat for the Learning Metrics Task Force. It includes many of the people here on the podium as well as in the audience. And it's really about an effort to really mobilize, I guess, stakeholders, not only in education, but in development, around the importance of learning. And we heard again this morning this idea that it's a shift, that learning has to become a greater part of the conversation, and that it should be about access and learning. And I think Learning Metrics Task Force is really trying to push that, to mobilize groups around this kind of idea. And at a global level, we're in the middle now. I think some of you probably have already seen the report, which looks at then the different domains of learning. So we've defined what every child or youth should learn. And now we're in the middle of looking at measurement. And I think measurement is a much trickier issue. And we finally have to make some decisions about what is feasible conceptually, technically, to measure and to compile. Some of these areas include readiness to learn, literacy and numeracy, some things that we think we're actually quite good at measuring now, but also kind of competencies around analytic thinking, problem solving, ICT literacy, and so on, which are a little more challenging, and we're not quite sure if we're measuring it right. And we have different experiences from different parts of the world that we're trying to bring together and trying to mobilize different stakeholders around trying to better capture some of these issues. Then at the national level, it's not only about the learning metrics is definitely not about just coming up with some areas for global measurement. It's really about the national side too, and what's happening at the national and the local level. And one of the ideas is also around, how can countries and communities be better supported in trying to get a better understanding of the kinds of learning outcomes, learning opportunities for children and youth in their communities or in their countries. And it's definitely not about ranking countries in league tables. It's really trying to put the focus on better understanding the distribution of skills, and as Kevin showed in Malawi, who's actually achieving minimum mastery levels. I guess that was reading, and who's not. But trying to really better understand who's doing well, who's not doing well in the system, and what can be done to improve that, rather than simply ranking countries.
Great. Thank you, Albert. We have time for a few questions. I see a whole sea of people. Okay, we'll go in like a big circle. Okay, let's start here. And just, if I could urge you, or beg you rather, because I hate cutting people off, but I will, if you could keep it very sort of short and to the point, would appreciate it. And introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Hendricks. I'm the Global Gender Equality Advisor with Plan International and work on the Because I'm a Girl campaign. A fascinating discussion. I wanted us to hone in and to ask you a question about quality and gender equality. We assume that our focus on educational quality will in fact be sufficient for the promotion of gender equality, or for girls' lack of realization of rights. But we also know that approaches to quality may neglect the diversity or specificity of problems that, for example, adolescent girls face when being excluded from school because they may be pregnant. My question is as follows. Do you feel that the current debate in defining quality takes what is specific to gender equality and integrates this sufficiently? Such as equality of outcomes as opposed to equity approaches, which I think you pointed to, Kevin, in your Kenya example. And following from that, how do we ensure that gender equality is taken seriously in our plans for education quality? What would this involve so that gender equality is really addressed in a meaningful and substantive way in both material provisions of curriculum or teacher training, but also in terms of non-material provisions, such as changing attitudes and behaviors, and really tackling exclusions? Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Kamwanga Masankisi. I'm the chief advisor in charge of cooperation of the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's just, I think, a suggestion or an answer to the question that Rebecca asked here. And the question is, how do we do to close this gap? That's very important. And another question follow is, when are we going to close this gap? And I say now. And who is supposed to close this gap? Us. Because if we don't do it now, then it won't be sorted out. And if you look at the figure that we got there, we have out of 127 million, 30 million will never enroll. And 33 million will drop before primary school, which means more than 50% are out of school. They will never finish school, which means that we have 50% of consumers who are out of the market. Now the question is, who's losing? Is it only the government or the citizen? But I think it's also the business. And that's where the idea of saying this is not only the problem of the government, like Madame Baela said, but she said is also the problem of the citizen. But I'm adding now that is also the problem of business. This means that business should be also involved, because if business is not getting involved, it's losing itself, the business, if it doesn't know. So let's say that and the government, the business, the citizen, let all of us find a solution on this. As far as my country is concerned, for instance, because of our experience, we are saying if you want to solve this problem, if you want to close this gap, then let not be deal with the problems, but let deal with the source of the problems. And in this case, is to prevent wars, because if we prevent wars, then we won't have girls who miss the schools, and we won't have those children who are selling the breast to get the money. So that is my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh my gosh. Okay, all the way at the very back. All the way at the, yeah, right there, standing up in the white shirt. Yeah. Sorry, it's hard. Yes, please go.
You
yes.
can see me. Hi, my name is Yolande Mireguavo. I'm at USAID. I have a question for all of you panelists. The word conflict, except for my colleague from the DRC, the word conflict has not come up. And if you look at the issue of conflict in terms of access, we cannot look at access or no access. There's an in-between that is very important, which is the disruption of access. In most areas that are affected by conflict, or not even conflict, post-conflict, 20 years after conflict, access is disrupted. So kids go in, they come out. If a militia comes in and threatens to destroy the village, the school will close, people will not go back to school for another 3 months, and so on. It goes on like this for years and years and years. So I'd like to just throw a question at you in terms of the definition of access for conflict-affected or post-conflict affected environments. And finally, the inequality and equity, of course, go in hand or don't go in hand in hand. When you look at conflict-affected environments, there's a resistance to investing in these regions. I mean, in the Kivus, it's really hard to find donors who will stay in the Kivus. And if we deny the opportunity to these children to access schools, inequality is going to go, will just increase and increase and increase, and we'll have more, violence and more grievances. And so I'd like to know how whether you've seen that in your data and whether there are ways of addressing it through your data. I think I know the answer to the questions, but thank you.
Thanks, Yolande. Let's take two more. There's one here and then one here. Here, right on the edge with the gentleman standing. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Adrian Verspoor. I'm a retired World Bank, and 23 years ago, I was involved in the organization of the Jomtien Conference. That gives me a bit of a perspective on where we are today. I think the first reaction I have is a positive one, in the sense that the issues are not new. That's déjà vu all over again. Huh? But I think the way we talk about issues, the evidence we have, the understanding and the analysis, I think we have progressed a lot. And I thought Kevin's presentation demonstrated that quite clearly. The work that UNESCO has done, I think, is quite remarkable in this area. In spite of, as we know, there are still all sort of data problems that we have. Where I think we have not made much progress is where Kevin left off. And they said, what's the strategy? How are we going to deal with the issue of the whatever number you want, 30%, 40%, 50% of the children that do not get a good quality basic education, who typically will be out in rural areas, urban slums, female. That we still are groping for a solution. Now, I disagree a bit with Kevin that more money is a solution. I would argue we really need to take a step back and ask ourselves, is the delivery model that we, World Bank at the time, UNESCO, UNICEF, the delivery model that we've all bought into, is that the delivery model that will be able to deliver a good quality education to all children? The model we bought into is the civil service model. The civil service model, 6 classrooms, 6 teachers, 40 kids in each classroom. And my impression is that that model has not been able to deliver what we are after. The challenge is to rethink that model and say, well, is it possible to design a delivery model that actually reaches the poor? Could we learn something from private companies that are selling goods and services to poor people in rural areas? Can we learn something from some of the isolated NGO experiences, which has never been scalable?
Thank you. I think it's a very good point. I think we got it. It's well made. I'm sorry to cut you off. This is the question I wanted to ask. Thank you very much. We just have one more, the gentleman in the yellow shirt, and then I'm gonna ask the panelists to respond quickly, and then we will
My name
break.
is Rolando. I'm a member of Youth Advocacy Group for UN Global Education First, and I'm a teacher for children with disabilities in the Philippines. I think this is not a question. This is more of like a reflection that a very important sector to respond to the diversity and inequality of education is the attitude of the teachers. I've worked with teachers in the Philippines, and the moment we bring a child with a disability in their class, they usually say, "I'm not trained to accommodate a child with a disability." So I think it's very important that we also invest on increasing the capacities of teachers to work for children with disabilities. However, the challenge has always been, if these teachers are already in the system, sometimes it's hard to shift their paradigm on attitude. So it's also important that we work on pre-service, meaning to say student teachers, that when they're still students in a university taking education as a course, we need to change their perspective the earliest time possible so that when they go to the field of teaching, they're more prepared and most importantly, they're more committed to serve children with disabilities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I want to give a chance for each of the panelists to comment briefly. There was a range of interesting questions here. One around the linking up between quality and gender equality. A couple, again, from DRC as well as from USAID around conflict and various other questions. A question about delivery model, a question about disabilities. If you could comment just briefly, each of you, please don't try to answer all of them. And then, unfortunately, we've run out of time and we will break for lunch, but we welcome conversations with all of the panelists and amongst you over lunch.
Just very quickly on the issue of equality and gender equality. The data that we gather is very, very nuanced on that. As I said, district by district, area by area, village by village. And what is coming out is, although we see that, of course, girls are worse off, not just in terms of access, but also learning. There's about a 6 to 7% difference, particularly in learning. But in urban areas, some urban areas, boys are also disadvantaged. We see more boys out of school and boys learning less than girls. So we need to be able to look at these issues as precisely as possible and to be able to come up with ways and means to address those, as innovatively as possible. But coming to this issue of, good for business, I agree with you, but I think the whole point is, and as we've seen it as civil society, as people working with the government, this is seen as a very important social investment in oneself, personally and collectively. I think unless and until you invest in societies, you will not have the kind of human resource which is good for business also. I think we need a broader view on the issue of learning than this. And coming on to this issue of conflict, may I just suggest that, in districts, there are two kinds of things that we are finding, the trends. One is conflict areas where there is terrorism and so on, or high levels of political conflict. But also we are seeing increasingly more displaced populations for which there is no planning. So for example, somebody from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa coming from there and moving to Sindh and speaking only Pashto, and teachers are not equipped, nor there's any planning of how they will transit a child who's learning, whose mother tongue is Pashto, needs a scaffolding language, and a teacher doesn't know it. The conversations did not begin till we started the survey, and this year we will be focusing particularly in these areas and picking up these issues as we see them. So I think that's a beauty of a survey of this kind, which is being done with a kind of a rights-based approach, with very much a rights-based approach, but also to be able to bring government on board to recognize that this is very solid stuff and the government itself is using it, and how cleverly we can use the data for different type of stakeholders and decision makers to be able to use the data, whether it is from a gendered perspective or from a conflict perspective or from an urban-rural perspective. And I think we've seen quite amazing results in very short time, including the whole government of Punjab, which is about 100 million population out of 180 million, taking the data as a baseline to improve the learning levels. And we've seen some dramatic learning levels improved in a very short space of time. So it is a very nuanced. I would urge you, and we have some information, you can use that, look at it. Otherwise, it is aserpakistan.org. The data is yours. All the raw data is available.
Thank you, Bela. Albert.
It is a public service.
I just want to touch upon, I think it was good that Adrian brought up the issue of Jomtien and looked backwards a little bit, because I think it's really important that we take some lessons, from the last several decades. Because I think in Jomtien, I think it was very well articulated, issues around education quality, around learning at the center, all of these issues which we're kind of reinventing or renewing now, which I think were actually better articulated at that time. But I think it's important to see, why didn't we gain traction on equity? If we've been talking about equity for so long, if we've been talking about learning outcomes for so long, what's the barriers and bottlenecks? Why aren't we able to make better progress on this? And I think part of the issue does come back to the data. And when we look at some of the data that have been presented here, largely based on household surveys, largely funded by international donors, I think that's part of the problem. I think there's an issue about accountability and about the data and the use of the data within the ministry, within the government, to kind of tell some of these stories. And for me, that's an important barrier and bottleneck. That if we're serious about engaging on these issues now, I think a good step is that the international community is very strong and articulates this in a clear way. But I think the real challenge is going to be at the national level and building this into plans and getting it, not just the advocacy part, right, where we can say, oh, this is a problem, we can see this is a problem, but actually to the monitoring and the program part where it's much more difficult. And I think that's for me that's something we really need to keep in mind that we're, in some ways we're still very far away. There's still many countries that don't know if their children are learning or not.
Thanks, Albert. Sumaya.
Okay. With respect to gender, I think actually my response could be a lot longer. I feel, and this is actually from the other side. Basically, when we go in, it's when you look at education, you're not actually trying. We're actually not looking at it just in terms of schooling. So we're actually trying to see, because a lot of times what does happen is there is, and it's been discussed all morning, either you are in school but you're not learning. Language is a huge barrier, and it's more for us because English is actually preferred by a lot of families to actually push children into English medium schools. So all subjects are being taught in an alien language. It gets even harder when you don't know English or you don't know Hindi in context of India, where you speak a vernacular language. And a lot of displacements also happen, responding to your point, based on government schemes and beautification schemes that happen in cities, and that displaces the entire ecosystem. So it's not always also a larger conflict, but it's also sometimes that, and it also happens when schemes and policies change. So we had children who dropped out of school because afternoon schools were shut down, because the RTE forced everybody to go to the morning schools with the Right to Education Act. With specific to gender, I think getting the idea where you say first the idea of getting getting girls into school, I think it's longer because there are lots of reasons why learning stops. In terms of a lot of times you can't stop them from doing the household responsibilities that they do have, and a lot of them have a lot. And it's when you do go in and you do work, you have the boys who are playing and the girls who are assisting their mothers. So you have to kind of work around it, and that's what we try doing. And the idea is to slowly we've developed a point where, for example, we reached a point where parents were ready to send their children to school, and that in itself was a big thing. Secondly, we had girls, like we had one girl who dropped out of every single out-of-school program, and that was because of neighbors' pressures. We had an instance where a girl was being asked to drop out because both her parents had lost their jobs. So it wasn't that the idea wasn't that they were pro-child marriage, but the solution for them somehow seemed to be to marry off the daughter, because they said, okay, this way at least we can sustain something. So again, I think what I was saying, we're just the idea then also just in terms of strategies become, for each of them, it's a different solution. It's not the same. For one, it's to connect you to a vocational training opportunity or alternative learnings where you drop out, it's fine and a lot of times children come and say we need to drop out because of these reasons. And initially we used to say, no, you have to stay in school, and now it's changed to, okay, if you want to drop out, but what do you want to do and how do you want to go ahead, and then try creating a course. And sometimes that is a self-realization for them to stay back in school, which is also an unintended outcome. But I think I don't know if it was satisfactory.
Thank you very much. Kevin, last word.
Well, just 2 points really briefly. So, Adrian, I agree with one part of what you said, but not the other part. I didn't, by the way, say that financing was the solution to all of the problems. But I think you're right. We do need to think more innovatively about delivery if we want to achieve the goals that were set. But it is the case that financing is a problem. And, you know, if I look at some of the countries that we've worked on recently, and one of them is South Sudan, as a matter of fact. Now, you know, this is a country where you have a government that is committed to developing a strategy, that has put a strategy in place. You have a very strong NGO community that's able to reach communities which the government system can't currently reach. You have a partnership in the country that is, you know, that is trying to sort of fill some of the gaps. The question is, if you come up with an ambitious plan in a country like that with financing requirements, where do you go? And the answer is nowhere. And I think you see in one country after another. I mean, Bangladesh is another very good example. You have an incredibly strong NGO community that's working with some of the hardest to reach children in flood areas, in hill tracts, that is currently massively underfinanced, you know, with the capacity to scale up, but nowhere to go in order to get the financing, you know, in partnership with government. It's the same, I think, in Eastern DRC. You know, you have very strong NGOs working with government on delivery, but locked into very short-term humanitarian financing arrangements. Now, you know, I think unless we close this financing gap in an innovative way, you know, we may as well not have come up with the goals and the promise that we produced in the first place. So, you know, I think it's really important that there are so many governments and finance ministers here this week to push these proposals, and it's incumbent on the donor community to respond in a creative way. And the very last point, Rebecca, briefly, you know, I think it's also really important that we remember that when we're talking about marginalization in education and inequality in education, this is not a silo. I mean, these kids that you're describing and working with are carrying all of the disadvantages that come to their home environment into the school. You know, the disadvantage of their caste, you know, of their gender in some cases, of their disability in other cases. And it follows from that we can't tackle this problem purely through education sector interventions. There's an awful lot that has to happen in a joined-up way through national poverty reduction strategies, you know, through strategies that are targeting changing attitudes and targeting the marginalized in other areas. And I like a lot of the discussion that we've had this morning, I think reflects a wider problem that we treat education and disadvantaged education as though it's about what happens in the school and the classroom. And frankly, 80% of it is what's happening outside of the education sector. You know, and we really need to think more seriously about how we put education right at the heart of national strategies for poverty reduction.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks to all the panelists. Thank you for indulging us. We're a bit over time, but I believe, I'm looking at Katie or Robin or somebody, we're going upstairs for lunch? Is that right? Okay, we go upstairs, right? Okay, anyways, before we do a round of applause, just to direct traffic, we do have lunch for those who would like to stay if you just go right up the stairs as you leave. So thank you for staying, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.